I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we discuss the latest updates from the war zone, looking at the advances made by Ukraine in Kherson, Zaporizhzhia and Donetsk, and we speak to Dr Sasha Dovzhyk about nuclear threats, the Sham referenda, and Ukrainian literary culture.
We
are facing a very serious crisis in energy caused by Putin's war in Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Monday, the 3rd of October. Day 222, and today I'm joined by Associate Editor Dominic Nichols, Assistant Comment Editor Francis Durnley, and our guest, Dr Sasha Dovzhyk, Associate Lecturer of Ukrainian at UCL's School of Slavonic and East European Studies and Special Projects Curator at the Ukrainian Institute. I started off by asking Dom for the latest updates from the war zone.
Well, hi, David, and hi, everybody. It has been very busy in the last few days in Ukraine. Firstly, to the northeast on the sort of Kharkiv front. So that, after the big advance of a few weeks ago, that sort of slowed down along the line of the Oskil River, which runs north-south through that region there. Russia had to fall back. It wasn't really up to them how far back they fell. In that forward dash of a few weeks ago, Ukraine were just racing ahead. There was no sort of natural geographic boundary that Russia could fall back to. It was only when Ukraine felt that their forces were going to be overextended that they sort of paused, and that line sort of solidified in mud, if you like, literally and figuratively, along the line of the Oskil River. The southern end of that is the town of Liman, which was a major logistic hub that Russia was using to bring supplies down from Belgorod and from Russian homeland, if you like, down into Ukraine and further on into the Donbass. So Liman became the focus of the Russian defence, if you like, that and the towns of Crimea to the east. But Liman was a major hub. That fell on Friday. We talked about it at length last week. It's been under extreme pressure for weeks now. And it fell to Ukraine, or rather was retaken by Ukraine, literally as Putin was on his ridiculous stage in Moscow, supposedly signing the paperwork, and dotting the I's and all the rest of it for annexing the 4 regions after that ridiculous the Sham referendums last couple of weeks. So, I mean, somewhat poetic, if you like, if it was happening at exactly the same time. But I'll come back to it in a moment. I think Liman and the effort that's happening now in Kherson to the south, I'll come on to that in a moment, are the battles to really look at and examine almost more so than the Kharkiv dash, but I'll come on to that in a minute. But Liman was retaken by Ukrainian troops, a classic sort of, they cut it off from the north, the supplies from the north and the east. There was one road out to the northeast that through which Russia could try and escape or be resupplied. It was very much more the former than the latter. Covered by Ukrainian fire, artillery and missile fire, increasingly watched by drones. So we don't have a figure for personnel or equipment that was lost there, but it seems as if it was Russia just lost the chance. They should have pulled out a lot longer ago, certainly days, if not weeks ago. There's reports that actually that was directed personally by Putin, that they were not to retreat, and they've lost the town and seemingly hundreds, if not thousands, of troops and their equipment as a result. They're now falling back to the east, increasingly harried by Ukrainian forces as they do so. And I made the point at the start of this update that the front line there is not entirely calcified. It is sticky because the Ukrainian advance is still continuing. There are not obvious geographic features that Russia can mount a credible, coherent defence on at the moment. So it is, crumbling is far too strong a word. It doesn't seem to be crumbling, but it is very, very porous, and that the front line around there is absolutely not fixed. In the centre of the Donbass, Russia is still smashing its head against the town of Bakhmut. Quite wide, not entirely sure. It is a sizable town, but actually that's not where the battle is in the Donbass right now, so quite why they're still pushing there. And it seems to be mostly Wagner, the private military mercenary group there in Bakhmut. Comes back to the issue we've spoken about in the past, that this is not one coherent Russian force. You've got the Russian army, what's left of it, the new conscripts, the Wagner group, you've got the self-styled Luhansk and Donetsk People Republic militia, and none of them are kind of working together. They don't know how to work together. They don't have a cultural sort of history of working together and working on joint operations. So quite why we should expect them to get their operations in one sock, so to speak, is a bit fanciful, I guess. So they're not able to mount a credible attack there, and seemingly it's just the Wagner group that are smashing away at Bakhmut to little gain. Down in the south on the Kherson front, just in the last 24 hours, now this has been very interesting. Over the last number of weeks, we've seen Ukraine shape the battlefield down there, and by shaping we mean spend a long time trying to destroy ammunition dumps, headquarters, artillery positions, long-range precision missile positions, as well as dropping the bridges across the Dnipro River and sealing off, we think, about 5,000 Russian troops on the northern side, the north and the western side of the Dnipro, the right bank of the Dnipro. We talk about rivers and the way they are flowing. So the right bank will be the some more inland bank of the river. A huge number of Russian soldiers trapped there, with only sort of very meagre pontoon bridges across the river to resupply them. So that front has been fairly static for a few weeks. There was a suggestion that was the feint to draw in Russian reserves and the very long-range, precise artillery and missile systems from the Donbass down to the south. That happened. Those troops and that equipment were moved to the south. Whether or not it was a feint, because that then was followed up by the Kharkiv advance, I don't think it was a feint. Actually, I think they were two coherent and coordinated operations. But now in Kherson, so this steady advance, what Russia's been trying in the centre, albeit grinding away, very attritional, very heavy in terms of their own manpower. Ukraine have been taking that kind of that measured approach, not gaining a huge amount of ground, but also not committing a huge amount of resource and not losing a huge amount of people and equipment in the process. So they've been sort of protecting their combat power. But just in the last day, around the banks of the river, so as they are moving south, if you can picture it from Ukraine's point of view, moving south, so their left flank, the Russian right flank near Zaporizhzhia, that kind of area, they seem to have advanced. There are reports of 20 or 30 kilometres. Now, whether or not this is an advance there or some kind of raid or possibly an air assault operation, we don't know. But it looks as if Ukrainian troops have broken through on that area, on Ukraine's left flank there, possibly down as far as the river. Whatever is happening there, it is very dynamic, so we can't give you an exact idea of what's going on. But it seems as if this we likened it to some sort of massive Jenga game earlier on, where Ukraine was sort of probing, looking for the weak spots, and then reinforcing those areas where they were gaining some ground and having tactical success. That now seems to be happening. As I say, this area down the river on Ukraine's left flank, they do seem to be having a measure of success there, and are pushing on. So very fluid in the across the whole country, across the battle space. Happy to come back later and say why I think those operations around Liman and what we're seeing in Kherson, what we think we're seeing in Kherson, are arguably the more important battles and the more important operational design to look at, rather than the sort of Mad Max Kharkiv race through the lines. If there's time, we can talk about that. But in terms of battlefield movements, that's it for now.
Well, thank you very much for that, Dom. Dom and Francis, you weren't here on Friday, so I just wanted to ask quickly for your reaction to Putin's speech that he made in Moscow on Friday. And Dom, I mean, you put it almost in poetic terms at the beginning of your update just then. So I just wanted to ask, before we move on, Dom and Francis, what are your thoughts on what he said?
Well, I'm happy to come in on that first. I mean, there's been some interesting events since then which relate to the speech. So I'll cover those first. So we've heard that Russia has now said that it has funds to support 4 Ukrainian regions which Putin began annexing last week, said that those are going to come out of the country's budget. We don't exactly know how much those are, and neither do we know the exact nature of the borders yet. The Kremlin have said that they will consult with the residents who are living in two of the regions, that's Kherson and Zaporizhzhia, on how those borders will be defined. But you mentioned the speech, and indeed, I think the speech is interesting for looking at how exactly Putin is justifying this, as well as there being some further points that I just wanted to sort of point out from it. So if one looked at the speech last week, one of the things that he said, and I'm pulling a direct quote out here, is, of course, it is their right, their inalienable right, which is enshrined in the first article of the UN Charter, which directly speaks of the principle of equal rights and the self-determination of peoples. So there, of course, he's talking to these Sham referenda. He says, I repeat, this is an inalienable right of the people based on historical unity in the name of which the generations of ancestors won, those who from the origins of ancient Russia for centuries created and defended Russia. And so it goes on. So I just want to point this out first of all, because it's a classic strategy of Putin's. He appeals to the language and the philosophy of the West, whilst actually doing the exact opposite. So he talks about the first article of the UN Charter and the right for self-determination, but then goes into this sort of historical perspective, alluding back to the 18th century and everything else that I've just quoted from there, as if this is in some way its own form of justification, this sort of 1,000-year history, which, as I say, are actually inseparable in his mind. But as far as the way the UN thinks about these things, are totally separate matters. Just because Russia says that they are historically combined countries doesn't mean that it makes them the case that they are. But indeed, that seems to be Putin's argument. So there's that side of things. And then I was struck by several other points about the speech. So he talks about as well, and I'm quoting again here, at the same time, the West has been looking all this time and continues to look for a new chance to hit us, weaken and destroy Russia, which they have always dreamed of, split our state, pit peoples against each other, doom them to poverty and extinction. They are simply haunted by the fact there is such a great, huge country in the world with its territory, natural wealth, resources, with a people who do not know how and will never live according to someone else's orders. So again, he's staking the claim here of being this sort of civilizational force. And indeed, the way in which he's speaking here is as if this is a superpower nation, as if he's trying to rebuild Russia in the mentality of how it saw itself in the Soviet era. But it's worth, as I say, as I've made this point several times on the podcast in the past, this is a country that has an economy the size of Spain. And that's no insult to our Spanish listeners. I happen to like Spain very much. But this idea that they are a civilizational power with the kind of resources that the West has is simply delusional. And yet that is exactly how he is framing Russia here, as this civilizational force with a historical destiny. Again, on this historical point, I was very interested by his remarks where he says, let me remind you that the United States, together with the British, turned Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne and many other German cities into ruins without any military necessity during World War II. This was done defiantly, without any, I repeat, military necessity. There was only one goal, just as in the case of the nuclear bombings in Japan, to intimidate both our country and the whole world. So again, using history as a weapon here, trying to appeal to this idea that the military operations during the Second World War used by the Allies, by the United States and the British, were unjustified and were simply an attempt to, in a sense, as he puts it, intimidate both their country, our country, and the whole world. Well, just on a historical point on that this is highly disputable, that the attacks on Dresden, Hamburg and Cologne were simply atrocities, which is how he's trying to obviously depict this here. I'd point him to Albert Speer, who was actually the armaments minister towards the end of the Second World War for the Nazi state, who pointed very much about the significance of these attacks and what they meant for diminishing the Nazi capability to respond in terms of armaments production. I'd also point him to Richard Overy, who's a very distinguished military historian here in Britain, who said that the bombing raids on these cities were hugely significant in the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. And just the last point of the speech I wanted to pick out is he spoke at the end about the world being divided into how America views them, of vassals, so-called civilized countries, and the rest, false labels, rogue country, authoritarian regime, used to stigmatize entire peoples and states. They, this being the West, discriminate, divide peoples into the first and other grades. So again, he's trying to pitch here this idea that the West is somehow a colonialist power and that Russia is the buttress against this. And I just wanted to conclude by saying that I think this is a very, very deliberate pitch to the rest of the world at this moment when Russia does not have any real allies to speak of. It's clearly trying to use the language of those countries like in Latin America, Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, that use this narrative of a colonialist West, and he is seeking to try and bring them in to the Russian fold. And it's worth pointing out that Latin America and the Caribbean have signed up to China's Belt and Road Initiative and similar ones being conducted by Russia in Africa. We've seen the launch of Biden's Build Back Better, which is an attempt to try and do something similar not only domestically, but also build back the better world. This attempt to try and do a similar program to be spreading democracy around the world. And you know, this is an obvious attempt to try and stake a claim to Russia being the voice of an anti-colonialist world that doesn't want to be part of the West. Will it work? I think it remains to be seen and will be very much reliant on China's support. But nonetheless, I thought there were some interesting things that should be picked out and analysed a little bit more deeply from the speech. This inaccurate historical comparisons, this civilizational approach to how Russia is pitching itself in this battle of ideas around the world, and also seeing itself as the foremost anti-colonialist, anti-Western power, and appealing to the rest of the world to assist it in this great generational battle. It's worrying.
Thank you very much, Francis. Dom, very, very quickly, your reaction to the speech, and then we'll move to Sasha.
I would just note that the Institute for the Study of War, US-based think tank, who have been watching the war very closely and making some very considered and sensible analysis of it. They reported over the weekend that actually at the speech, at the great thing in Moscow, Putin had invited a number of the military bloggers that we've spoken about before. These hard right ultra nationalist bloggers who are very, very critical, openly critical of the Kremlin and the way they've conducted the war. A number of them were invited to the ceremony. Now, this is probably Putin's twofold way of getting his arms around them to say that we're all in this together, fellas. But also, I'm sure, just sort of feel the collar and say, right, lads, don't think that you can have it all your own way. So it'd be interesting to see what they're going to come out with in the next few days. Now, the most prominent of them, Igor Girkin, former FSB, he hasn't stopped his steady stream of criticism about the way that the war's being conducted. He's focused on the retreat from Liman, so he's still out there and speaking. But whether or not the others will, on Telegram, we will continue to watch and report. But it was just interesting that they were also personally invited, the military bloggers and a lot of journalists to the annexation, his so-called annexation speech, literally as Liman was falling.
Well, thank you, Francis, and thank you, Dom, for your analysis and your updates there. Sasha, it's wonderful to have you with us. Thank you so much for sparing some time to come on. Would you just introduce yourself to our listeners, tell us a little bit about what you're doing, and then we can see where the conversation goes?
Wonderful. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. My name is Sasha Dovzhyk. I'm a special projects curator at the Ukrainian Institute in London, and I'm also a lecturer in Ukrainian at the School of Slavonic and East European Studies at the UCL in London as well. However, I've spent the last 8 months mostly in Ukraine, occasionally traveling back to London. So I had a chance to witness the incredible resistance of the Ukrainian people to this invasion myself, and to participate in whatever way I could in this resistance by volunteering and reporting and helping journalists like yourselves to report on the ground. I'm very grateful to Francis for unpicking Putin's speech here because, my mental health is obviously not sturdy and robust enough to listen to his utterances. But from what I hear from other people and what I read, it looks like his speech was a classic case of psychological projection, because obviously it is Russia that tries to intimidate the whole world, including by the means of nuclear blackmail. And this is probably the subject I would like to dwell on. I come from Zaporizhzhia. It's the city in the southeast of Ukraine, which you have learned about by now, because the region of Zaporizhzhia contains the largest nuclear plant in Europe. It is in the town near Zaporizhzhia in Enerhodar, which is currently occupied by Russians. And as you have discussed on this podcast, it is under constant shellings from Russia. And the latest development on the ground is that the director of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, Ihor Murashov, was abducted by the Russian occupiers. This obviously is a huge threat to the safety at the nuclear power plant, because Ihor Murashov is the top manager of a complex and it's a huge nuclear power plant. 7,000 people are reporting to their director, and this director is now taken out of the game, basically abducted, blindfolded, and taken into the unknown direction by the Russian military. This does not make the situation at the nuclear power plant any safer for any one of us, because the safety of the staff who are conducting all these complex operations at the plant is one of the safety pillars on which the entire security of the civil nuclear infrastructure is based. So Russia, being the power that has for the first time in history brought war to the site of civilian nuclear infrastructure, is responsible for this. Anything can go wrong at any moment, and the fact that we are not hearing about the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in the news during the past week or two does not mean that the situation there is under control. So we should all keep our eyes on that.
Thanks, Sasha. May I ask, what are the conversations like amongst Ukrainians at the moment in regards to the nuclear threats? What's the messaging from the government like? Are people sort of stocking up on supplies? How is it seen? How is it understood in Ukrainian society?
Of course. So in Zaporizhzhia, my aunt and my cousin have already received the iodide pills, the ones that will protect them in case of a nuclear accident. So those were distributed centrally by the local government. And in Kyiv, you may have heard that people are preparing for Russians using nukes on them. So it's another component of Russian nuclear terrorism. They are threatening with the use of tactical nuclear weapons on the centers of decision-making, such as Kyiv, or on our front lines in the east and south. So people in Kyiv have reacted, perhaps traditionally for Ukrainians, with humor, which is obviously gallows humor. They are currently planning an orgy on one of Kyiv's mountains to, meet the nuclear threat in style. But jokes aside, my friends are buying gum gloves and raincoats just to shield themselves from radioactive dust, just in case this happens, and they are seriously preparing to survive a nuclear strike in their city. I think this shows yet again that Ukrainians are not cowed by these threats, but they are prepared to withstand whatever comes.
Can I ask about the Sham referendums that have taken place across the 4 regions in Ukraine? What are you hearing from your friends and family on the ground? It's an interesting case, and I think that these sham referenda are
actually a media operation that is aimed basically at us. Ukrainians on the ground know that these referendums do not change anything, because we know that our friends and relatives were made to vote at gunpoint, and these votes have absolutely no legitimacy. People in Russia, I think, are not too excited by the annexation of Donetsk or Melitopol, because for them it's not as glamorous as Crimea. And this operation is first and foremost conducted for us to see how we in the West react to another annexation by the Kremlin. In 2014, our reaction emboldened Russia to proceed and to increase its military aggression against Ukraine. How do we react today? Is this the red line, the purple line, the pink line? I think this question is basically for us.
Thanks, Sasha. At the beginning of this recording, we obviously asked Dom for the latest updates from the battlefront, and he sort of gave us 10 minutes of what seems like pretty good news for the Ukrainian armed forces, pushing Russian forces back in the east and Zaporizhzhia and in the south. What's the feeling on the ground amongst Ukrainians? How do people, presumably this has had a huge impact on morale. Would you give us a sense of how people in the country and the diaspora are speaking about this?
Well, basically, people are enthusiastic. And I think that there was an avalanche of good news for Ukrainians in terms of our progression on the front. And with each day, we believe more strongly that we will take back all our territories and that we will also release all of our people from captivity. This is probably not the breaking news, but you know that the Azovstal defenders were released a couple of weeks ago. And this is still celebrated throughout Ukraine. And I think that it shows how much each person's life is valued in the country, because it still brings tears to our eyes to look at the released defenders of Ukraine and to hear them speak and to ensure that they are free now.
One of the things Francis picked up on from Vladimir Putin's speech was this attempted casting of Russia as essentially an anti-colonialist power. I just wanted to ask you about, if you're comfortable talking about it, your own experiences growing up in Ukraine and going from growing up almost in the Soviet shadow, and then that slowly being thrown off through the 90s and 2000s. What do Ukrainians think of when they hear that Russia is attempting to cast itself as that anti-colonial power?
Thank you for this question. I grew up in Zaporizhzhia, as I've mentioned, and this is a predominantly Russian-speaking region. It was forcibly Russified. I come from a Russian-speaking family, and I switched to Ukrainian after 2013-2014, after the Euromaidan revolution, or the Revolution of Dignity, when it became clear for me that my loyalty is to the Ukrainian state, and that the language, the culture of Ukraine that have been suppressed for centuries and throughout my growing up are weapons that I can yield in this war against the colonizer state. And it is obviously quite ridiculous today to hear that colonizing power to cast itself as somehow a vehicle of an anti-colonial struggle. We in Ukraine know that our language and culture and literature and our people's very right to exist have been under threat from Russian colonial rule for centuries. And I think that this war has made it clear to everyone in the world that this is the case.
Thank you very much, Sasha, for that. Dom and Francis, you've been listening. Francis, I know you've got a couple of questions on culture. Would you like to come in?
Thanks, David. Hi, Sasha. Thanks so much for appearing today. I just had a question relating to a piece of yours that I read, which is about the significance of Ukrainian culture and the spirit of resistance that we've seen since the invasion. Just wondered if you could talk a little bit about the role of Ukrainian poetry and culture more broadly, and how Russia is seen in that context.
Of course. Thank you for this question. It was very touching, moving to witness how Ukrainian poetry has become this another vehicle of resistance in Ukraine. We started seeing words by century-old Ukrainian poets like Taras Shevchenko and Lesya Ukrainka printed on A4 paper and stick to the doors of bomb shelters, because suddenly all those lines started speaking directly to us. Those poets have been speaking against Russian colonialism, against suppression of Ukrainian resistance, and emboldening people in their right for their own culture or own language, own literature for decades. Like the most famous line by the Ukrainian poet Taras Shevchenko is "Fight and you will prevail." Countless times I have seen this on the chevrons of Ukrainian defenders who are now at the front lines. This has become one of the slogans of Ukrainian resistance today. And culture that has first timidly come back to life after Russian invaders have been expelled from the Kiev region is now thriving there. I just keep coming back in my memories to the day of the Ukrainian Air Forces, the 7th of August, which I spent in the St. Sophia Cathedral in Kiev. It was the day when there was a festival of Ukrainian culture taking place in this 11th century cathedral. And we were listening to Ukrainian classical choir standing under the 11th century mosaics, which reminded us about the richness of our culture, about its longevity, despite all the attacks against it. And it was quite empowering thinking that today our army is defending us against this invasion. And so is this century-old Ukrainian tradition, which, despite all the attempts to eradicate it, is thriving today.
Dom, would you like to come in?
Yes, please, if I may. Thank you. Sasha, hi. Great. Thanks so much for talking to us. On the cultural front, can you just please give us your view on the Russian-speaking versus Russian-supporting idea? I've probably been guilty of it myself. In fact, I know I have, of talking about describing some areas as mainly Russian-speaking, as if that then directly equates to some other sort of cultural support or cultural leaning. And you know, I've educated myself on that. But just can you talk us through how so many people in Ukraine are Russian-speaking? Sort of, they might use it at home, but that doesn't mean that they are Russian supporting, and quite where the balance is and how it's shifted over time.
Of course, language does not mean political loyalty in Ukraine. We are mostly bilingual, so we switch between languages easily, between Ukrainian and Russian, especially in the eastern Ukraine. And I think that it is quite clear that there has not been such a successful Ukrainianization campaign in this region as the recent full-scale invasion, because all of my relatives, neighbors, friends who are Russian speakers and who remain in Zaporizhzhia and who are currently hiding from shellings daily because Russia has intensified its attacks and its bombings of the place, have become incredibly furious and angry, and there is no power in the world that can convince them to leave alone join Russia in whatever mad fantasy, but just to speak to Russia and to listen to Russians and what they have to say. Russians coming with military aggression into the Ukrainian land has been a huge a breaking point to the Russian soft power in Ukraine. I think it will never come back. Russia will never be able to exercise its influence on Ukrainian people again. Basically, it's the last days of the empire, and Ukrainian people will be the ones to deliver the last blow.
It's such an easy trap to fall into, and as I say, I'm guilty of it myself. And is it a trap, or is it just sort of lazy thinking and an ignorance of culture? I suppose is a bit of all of that. But no, it's something that we need to self-police. And with these ridiculous referendums, last week, as I've become more aware of it, I see it more and more in the press. An easy shorthands like, they're Russian speaking, etc., etc. So no, thank you for helping us on that. On language, one more question, if I may. So Putin's speech the other day, it was very coming up, very heavy on the old red meat. It was a kind of warped version of history. It was a bit of a history lesson. Does Russian society and does Ukrainian society respond to this? Are people listening to this kind of stuff and are sort of receptive to this kind of history lesson, or is it just all a bit dull? And he was kind of speaking to his own audience.
I can't speak for the Russian population. Luckily, I don't have any contacts with those. In Ukraine, we have stopped paying attention to these lunatics' utterances quite a while ago. I think the last time we tried to listen to Putin's utterances attentively was on the 24th of February when he declared the war on Ukraine. But since then, we've experienced the full-scale invasion. We've seen that we could withstand it, and we've become more interested in, our own vision of history than Putin's madman projections. So no, his vision of Ukrainian or Russian history does not have any impact on how Ukrainians perceive themselves. It is quite clear to everyone that these are just, madman utterances. And in general, I think the less airspace we dedicate to deciphering Putin's and Russians' soul-searching, the better. Because, the conversations about the region have been dominated by the neo-imperialist narratives produced by Russia for a very long time. And this is one of the reasons why we underestimated Ukrainian ability to resist. The less attention we pay to Russian fantasies, the fantasies about Russian resistance, the fantasies about Russian opposition to the Kremlin's regime, the better for all of us. Let's focus on what Ukrainians are doing right now, that is winning in this war, rather than thinking about what Russians might do. They might overthrow their regime. I bet they will not.
If I could just jump in there, Sasha, I was very struck by what you were saying a moment ago about this reappraisal of history following the invasion. I just wonder if you can give some examples of perhaps past history in relation to Ukraine that you're now, as a consequence of what happened in February, rethinking about.
I'm currently thinking about the 1991 referendum when Ukrainian people marched en masse to vote themselves out of the Soviet Union. This happened on the 1st of December 1991, and the Soviet Union collapsed in 1 week. So it's fair to say that it was the Ukrainian people that delivered that last blow to the Soviet Union. And, thinking about that, we now understand that there is some succession to this tradition, that we will also perhaps be the people who will deliver the last blow to the Russian colonial project these days.
Thank you. And one final one from me. You spoke also about this renaissance in Ukrainian literature following the invasion, particularly in the context of poetry. If you were to be thinking ahead, what do you think that literature will look like in the months and years ahead, particularly perhaps for the benefit of an international audience? And also perhaps you could summarise some of the central themes of Ukrainian literature. I don't think many of us were intimately familiar with Ukrainian literature prior to the war, and perhaps you could summarise some of its sort of key themes for us.
Thank you for this question. Well, I think that the key theme of Ukrainian literature is what we call in Ukrainian voля, freedom. It's the fight for freedom. It's the fight for liberation. And it's not only the, sturdy male poets like Taras Shevchenko, who is obviously a fascinating case, but there are more fascinating cases for me. For example, Lesya Ukrainka, who was the feminist poet of the fin de siècle era, so the turn of the 19th, 20th century, who was an anti-colonial thinker, a feminist thinker who fought against all forms of oppression. And one of her plays, Cassandra, is basically something many Ukrainians can identify with today. Ukrainian Cassandras has become some sort of syndrome, a self-description. Ukrainians who have been warning the world about Russian aggression, about Russian imperialism for a very long time, were not believed, were not listened to, today can witness the result of that epistemological distrust. This play will be on London stage the next week, and I invite everyone to partake in this renaissance of Ukrainian culture. We now have this in a new translation by Nina Murray. And I think this is symptomatic of the larger interest in Ukrainian literature, in Ukrainian culture, and that is currently burgeoning outside of Ukraine. Finally, we can see new translations of classical Ukrainian poets, as well as modern Ukrainian poets emerging worldwide. I can recommend the poet Katerina Kalitko. She's one of those Ukrainian Cassandras who has been writing about war and genocide long before the current full-scale invasion. And she is a very strong poetical voice. As well as Serhiy Zhadan. You probably have heard about his novel, The Orphanage, which describes the eastern Ukrainian war-ravaged territories. And this novel, it was, I think, published in 2017. It reminds us that this war has been going on for quite a long time. The invasion did not start in February. We've been in this since 2014. So basically the future of Ukrainian poetry, of Ukrainian literature, of Ukrainian culture, for better or for worse, will be linked to the processing of the current massacres. But I think there will be many lessons to learn from this culture, from this writing.
Sasha, may I ask, is there anything we haven't spoken about that you'd like to bring to the attention of our listeners?
I think that you've been covering very thoroughly Russian nuclear threats, but there is still this threat of using tactical nuclear weapons against Ukrainian civilian population as well as against the army on the front lines that I think we should be discussing again and again, because it is unclear to me what will our response be like if Russia crosses this red or pink or purple line yet again. What consequences, apart from grave, there will be? What will Russia face as our response? I think this response has to be articulated more clearly, and it has to be stated to Russia and to the Russian population so that this line is not crossed.
Dom, I don't know if you want to just jump in and add something to that?
Yeah, well, we spoke last week about what a response might be like. This was after Jake Sullivan, the US National Security Advisor, said that there would be, quote, catastrophic consequences, unquote, of any Russian use of nuclear weapons. And I mean, there is no more detail on that. I hasten to add straight away. We don't know what these catastrophic consequences might be. But the two ways of thinking about it are to think whether or not it's linked to the geography of Ukraine, i.e., does something happen against Russia in Ukraine or in the immediate areas of it? So if a missile was fired, let's say either from the Black Sea or from Crimea or from Belgrade in Russia, would the West then take action against that unit, that launcher? So linked very much to the geography of the war. And the other way to think about it is conceptually. So does the response come in a military response, either nuclear or conventional, or would it be something completely outside the realm of the military arena? So to say to Russia, we'll strike back in a way of our choosing, anytime, any place. It doesn't have to be military. It could be economic or any other means. Of course, there are inherent dangers with both. That if you just stick to the military and stick to the geographic region of Ukraine and the environs, that you are. That the message might almost be, oh, well, this is just a natural sort of development of the war, and of course it's not. There's nothing natural about it at all. But equally, if you try and do something outside geography and the sort of the military sphere, you risk escalating, and a whole number of unintended consequences of previously uninterested or uninvolved actors and countries could get involved. So it's called horizontal and vertical escalation. Vertical being sort of more of the same, only bigger, and horizontal being something you haven't used before. So these two areas of escalation and response will be war gamed, I'm sure, right now across the various parliaments and military structures looking at Russia. But it's a very, very tricky response and a very difficult thing to get right because it hasn't been done before.
Well, thank you, Dom, for that, and thank you, Sasha, for all of your time today. We're starting to run out of time together, I'm afraid. So can I just ask each of you, just for your final thoughts, what will you be thinking of over the next few days, looking ahead to this week, and what would you want our listeners to think of? Dom and Francis, why don't you go first and leave Sasha for the final words?
Sure. Well, I think for me, I'm going to keep an eye on the Russian military blogosphere because they have been very, very critical of Russia's conduct in this war so far, as in not their moral conduct, but critical of what they've actually achieved in terms of ground. I don't think the Sham party rock concert, whatever the hell it was last week, is going to shut them up for very long. I'm wondering how long they're using this argument that well, look what Ukraine are doing when they've been given loads of NATO weapons. I mean, they're not saying just imagine what could happen if NATO then pile in with these NATO weapons. I mean, they're trying to excuse Russian battlefield failure. And there's only so many excuses you can come up with after a while. So I think the Russian military blogosphere is going to be re-energized after Ukraine have retaken Liman and whatever is happening right now in Kherson. They are not going to shut up for very long, even though they were invited to the party. And they seem to be the only flank really that is causing Putin some pain right now. So keep an eye on the blogosphere.
Just very quickly, Dom, I thought what you just said there was quite interesting because it's an interesting example of not quite accepting that the reason that the Russian forces are losing is because of the Ukrainian army. I mean, obviously equipped with NATO weapons, but they're the men and women firing the things and executing the combined arms manoeuvres, and that inability to see that is quite revealing.
Oh yeah, it's completely revealing. I mean, this is racism 101, right? They refuse to accept that actually it's the Ukrainian men and women who are fighting. I mean, let's not the defense of Kyiv in the opening hours and days of this phase of the war. I mean, they weren't awash with NATO weapons then. But of course, Putin's not going to come out, and these people are not going to come out and say, "Oh, it's the stout defence and the very very intellectually competent operational design that the Ukrainian military have come up with, married to the politics, married to the social media." I mean, they just simply can't do that because then they've got nowhere else to go. So, of course, this is all down to NATO. It's all the NATO weapons, and they're not going to acknowledge in the slightest the Ukrainian men and women who are firing these things. But I mean, it's a little bit. It's a little bit of both, of course, but we should not take away the fact that what they are saying, what they are talking about, even if they're not vocalising it, is that their army is going backwards. I mean, they're talking about one of the Russian state TV channels. I can't remember which one, but I was looking at it over the weekend. They were saying how Liman had been a bloodbath for Ukraine, and that Russia's forces had repositioned, withdrawn. I think they used the word. I don't think they said retreat, but withdrawn to other positions to continue the bloodbath. I mean, it is literally ridiculous. It is worthy of ridicule. It is ridiculous. But they are running out of excuses, and so is Putin running out of excuses.
Thank you, Dom. Francis Turnley.
Thank you. Well, actually, I want to do something a little bit differently with my final thought, if that's all right, and that is point readers and listeners to a piece that we had in the paper over the weekend, which is really, really fascinating. I've spoken at length about some of these long reads in the Washington Post that have certain revelations in them that I think reframe how we need to think about certain central problems, and indeed I think this piece does that. It's a piece by a Russian investigative journalist called Farida Rustamova, and she has been speaking to 15 civil servants, parliamentary deputies and executives at public and private companies in Russia, many of them senior managers, trying to register the general mood in Russia amongst the elite at present. And indeed, as I've talked about in the past, this is one of the many unknown quantities that really is absolutely critical to understanding what happens next. And amongst the revelations that are in this piece, the first is that there appears to be very little sincere support for the war in the Russian establishment now, those who are the sort of educated doers in society, not those who are just sort of wedded to the regime and the ideology, but these are the people who actually have to follow the orders, and saying that many of them revert to this defence mechanism of talking about the Second World War and this sort of war against NATO. But in fact, this is, as I say, a defence mechanism rather than it being actually a sincere belief. A quote here is that everybody's mood is similar to that expressed by the Defence Chief of Staff at that Security Council before the war. We've obviously spoken about that meeting at length and its significance, and it would appear that many people and government officials are sharing that view if this investigation is to be believed. Nonetheless, however, whilst they are not supportive of the direction of travel with the war, there also seems to be a lack of recognition or ability to contemplate what happens if they are defeated. I mean, it seems to be this is something that is unconscionable, and there is no answer to that. And I think that should be a concern. But the other big revelation, and the one that I think is perhaps most significant, is this belief amongst the Russian elite that Putin is becoming increasingly rash and secretive and micromanaging in the face of the military defeats. He doesn't explain anything to anyone, is what is a quote from one of the sources. There's a total lack of coordination. It's a mess. Putin tells everybody different things. What are we doing in Kharkiv? No one has a clue. Neither politicians nor the military. It's just happened. Now, if this is true and Putin is just sort of micromanaging, keeping everything from everybody, I think it gives an answer to one of the central questions that I posed many months ago now when the war began, which is Putin more of a Stalin figure, or is he more of a Hitler? Stalin was somebody who operated more in terms of rationalism. He operated in the realm of sort of realpolitik, and he was willing to, certainly after the catastrophe of 1941, was willing to concede power to those who knew better, his generals like Zhukov, etc. Hitler never was. Hitler continued to live in this sort of delusional world of his own creation, and in fact got even deeper into it. Now, of course, if he is more of a Hitler, I think that makes his defeat inevitable. One cannot micromanage one's way out of a war that is going sour. But it also makes him more dangerous, because for the reasons that are obvious, Hitler as a sort of an idealist, a man committed to an ideology, ultimately would, I think, had he had access to nuclear weapons at the end of the war, have been willing to use them, even if it had meant destruction of the Reich. We more or less have that documented, that was the mentality that he had. And if Putin really does share that, then I think there is, as I say, a considerable cause of concern there. Now, of course, it's a very different question as to whether he is capable of using those weapons. I'm not saying that he is capable of using those weapons for all of the caveats that I've thrown in the past. But this question about his intention and what kind of operator is he, I think we're now getting closer to an answer, and it's one that I think is a concerning one.
Well, thank you very much, Dom Nichols and Francis Sternley. Sasha, would you like the final words, please?
Thank you. Well, over the next weeks, I will probably be watching the world leaders' response to President Zelensky's extraordinary application for Ukraine to join NATO. I think it was a very worthy response to the blah, blah, blah of Vladimir Putin in retaliation of the so-called annexation of the Ukrainian temporarily occupied territories, Zelensky filed an application to join NATO. It's a bold move, and I don't expect it to be met with similar boldness from the NATO members, but we'll see. And I'll be watching how the world responds to the challenge of the latest Russian war crimes and to the challenge of the latest Ukrainian successes on the military front, because obviously Ukraine has showed that it can achieve victories on the battlefield if given the means necessary. So what means is the world ready to provide Ukraine with? I'm looking forward to hearing the answer to this question.
Thanks, Sasha. Just one more very quick question from me. For those people listening who want to start reading a bit more Ukrainian literature or poetry, is there a poet or a playwright or a writer that you'd recommend to everybody?
Well, I think it's good to start reading up on Ukraine from the history of Ukraine. And there is an extraordinary book, The Gates of Europe, by Serhiy Plokhy, who is also a Zaporizhzhia native, and I highly recommend it. And there is a series of lectures by the Yale professor Timothy Snyder that is currently ongoing, and I can't recommend enough watching those. In terms of literature, it's Lesya Ukrainka, whom I have already mentioned, but also there are some extraordinary Ukrainian writers and poets who are currently in London. For example, Katerina Babkina, who is a contemporary Ukrainian prose and poetry writer. I would recommend just familiarizing yourselves with her work.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. And sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message, and we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Claire Hubble.